Welcome to M4LU, Moms for Liberty's academic approach to the ideologies and issues facing our kids in the classroom. It is our mission to inform, equip, and empower parents with knowledge, understanding, and practical tools so that they may effectively advocate for their children and the future of our country. Hi, I'm Robin Steenman, Director of M4LU. Each month, M4LU will focus on a single topic and approach it from multiple angles in order to equip you, the parents, grandparents, and everyday American citizens with a deep understanding of what it is and how to navigate or combat it. We do this via 101 and 102 courses, a watch party, if a corresponding documentary film is available, and via the monthly book club. Each month, you will also find a corresponding toolkit added to our resource library at m4lu.org. We work hard to curate the information you need into a smart book for download, presentation slides, particularly useful for chapter chairs, a video section where our 101 and 102 recordings will live, white papers, articles, podcasts, and much more. This month, we are focusing on the issue of critical race theory, or CRT, including its praxis, DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. For many of us, CRT might feel like old news. For others, they might still not have heard of it. One thing is for certain, it's evolving. Let's find out what the average American really knows about CRT and DEI. We go to Christy Slape, our mom on a mission in the great state of Texas, to find out what people are saying about this ideology.
Howdy, y'all. I'm Christy, mom on a mission with Moms for Liberty. Today, we're in Leander, Texas at a political event asking people what they know about critical race theory. Here we go. Hi, I'm here with Paul. Paul, what do you do?
I'm a Leander ISD school board member in the state of Texas.
Well, I'm retired right now, so I'm mostly just a grassroots activist.
I'm a realtor and a real estate developer.
I am an education advocate.
Today, we're asking people here in Leander about CRT. Do those letters mean anything to you?
Critical race theory. It is a detriment to our kids.
Essentially, it is not taught in our public schools or higher education institutions, but it is in practice.
Yes, I've heard of it. It means a bunch of horrible stuff they're teaching in our schools these days.
It doesn't mean anything to me. I'm an immigrant who came here 25 years back. This is the most beautiful country in the world. If somebody calls this a racist country, that's a shame on them.
Do you see critical race theory being implemented anywhere in Leander ISD?
Well, as a school board member, I'm supposed to have access to everything, but what they do with me, since I'm a conservative school board member, is they hide everything. I have to ask the superintendent when I can go to a school and make an appointment. If I show up at the door, they literally won't open the door for me.
So basically, they just want a figurehead at the dais to represent some constituents, but they really don't let you get in the business of the district. Does that sound about right?
That is exactly what they've been doing with me.
Can you give us a little bit more information, just what you know about critical race theory?
They're teaching them feelings. They're teaching them things that aren't true. They're not teaching them reading, writing, arithmetic. They're not teaching them the life skills they need.
We have novels, not just in the public libraries or the Leander ISD campus libraries, but they're also in the children's English classrooms. So these are books within hand's reach of our kids. And not only do some of those books include pornographic materials, illustrations, or narratives, but they're also racist.
If a parent complained about a book like that, what kind of process do they go through, and can they get that removed from the school library or classroom?
It's almost impossible to get something taken out. They'll put a group of people where there'll be 4 administration and 4 people on the regular street. But if there's a tie, 4 and 4, the book stays in. The people that have read the books have been so traumatized to this point, they have had to seek therapy. These are very grotesque, demonic books, and they keep trying to push them that they're okay. They're simply a different way of learning. That's not true.
Have you had complaints or emails from your constituents about racial division, any kind of thing related to CRT in your schools?
I have, and what they usually try to do is they mask it as this is just teaching kids to be helpful, but the hidden agenda is obviously there. You just have to dig a little bit deeper.
Back 100 years ago, Alice Bailey wrote an education plan about taking over the schools and teaching their kids to be little government robots. Her plan became the United Nations education plan, and they're the ones that are trying to destroy our country.
So do you think that America is being divided by race currently in our government?
There are certain people who wants to divide this country based on race. That's very unfortunate. We as a party, especially the Republican Party, treats everybody equally. We don't believe in dividing people in any shape or form. The other side is the one which is constantly dividing people based on gender, based on race. We want every American to be equal, and that's what we are fighting for.
I am an American first.
Yeah.
That's what makes us so great. America is a melting pot. We love each other. We work hard together. But they've created a divide that we're not Americans first.
Yeah.
And we are living in America.
Yeah.
If I want to go back to my Irish roots or French roots or German roots or Congo roots, I would go back there. But I'm here. I'm an American. And we should treat Americans with love and respect.
Do you think there is a coordinated effort by the government or some outside entities to divide our nation based on race? And is that infused in our schools as well? Is that a coordinated effort in your opinion?
I would say that it is. We can get to the root of it, but to divide is definitely a mission.
And when you divide a country and you're able to break people down, do you know what kind of government usually ensues after that?
Well, I'm going to say communism.
Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate your answers and hope you enjoy the event.
All right. Well,
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us for Mom on a Mission with Moms for Liberty, and we hope to see you next month.
The landscape of CRT has certainly changed since parents were first privy to its teachings in 2020. The left went from labeling CRT naysayers as racist, to denying it was even taught, to just not mentioning it anymore. But parents are wise, and they know that this ideology is still present in schools. DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is a subset of CRT that many schools, and probably many of your employers, adopted. Most people struggled to articulate why they were not supportive of diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are all nice-sounding words, but the left's subtle redefinition of those words made it hard for many to fight back. M4LU exists to help with that. Please join us on February 4th for CRT 101, the 11th for DEI 102, the 19th for the online screening of Uncle Tom 2, and the 24th for a book club covering race Marxism. Our toolkit is live in the resource library and will be continually updated as resources become available and the issues evolve. We hope you'll check it out. Thank you for listening and for taking the time to get smarter on these issues affecting our children. In the words of our founding father and fourth president, James Madison, the advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only true guardian of liberty. Hi, welcome to CRT 101, the second month of M4LU, Moms for Liberty's newest academic approach to the ideologies facing our kids in the classrooms. I am Robin Steenman, director of M4LU. I'm in for Tiffany Justice tonight. Our format tonight is a series of live lectures by 3 individuals with key insight into this month's topic, which is critical race theory. Each lecture will last approximately 20 minutes, and then all 3 guests will be invited back to the stage for discussion and audience Q&A. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Author, mathematician, and political commentator Dr. James Lindsay has written 8 books spanning a range of subjects including education, postmodern theory, and critical race theory. Dr. Lindsay is the founder of New Discourses, an organization dedicated to shining the light of objective truth in subjective darkness. Dr. Lindsay is the co-author of Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody, and is also the author of Race Marxism, as well as his newest book, The Marxification of Education. Dr. Lindsay has been a featured guest on Fox News, Glenn Beck, Joe Rogan, and NPR, and he has spoken at the Oxford Union and the EU Parliament. Tonight, Dr. Lindsay's lecture will be covering the history of critical race theory, charting the path that it took
from Karl Marx in 1848 to Columbia University in 1935 to American law schools in the 1970s, and finally into our classrooms and mainstream American culture. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. James Lindsay.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you all for being here. So I'm going to try to chart a little bit of the history, the philosophical history behind critical race theory for you. I think it's very important to understand. I'll start out just by saying that critical race theory is three complicated words that can be summarized in two simpler words, which is race Marxism, or if you want, race communism. The idea behind critical race theory ultimately traces back to Karl Marx, as Robin said, introducing me in 1848, and actually in 1844. But if we take a look, in 1848, Karl Marx published the Communist Manifesto. And so I want to give you a couple of lines from the Communist Manifesto. I'm not going to quote them exactly, just from kind of paraphrase from memory. But the Communist Manifesto opens up by saying that the entire history of man can be characterized as the conflict between classes. And in fact, what Karl Marx explains is that the conflict between classes is what moves history. The movement of history from one period of time or epoch to the next is characterized by the conflict of one class against another. And the classes that are in conflict change. And he mentions a bunch of them. He mentions, the journeyman versus the guildmaster and so on. Ultimately, what he's saying, though, is that you have these periods in history, whether it's slave master versus slave, whether it's feudal lord versus his serf, whether it's the capitalist bosses versus their workers, that there's an intrinsic conflict between them, and history moves according to the development of that conflict. And he says that that conflict will end in one of two ways, which is the revolutionary reconstitution of society or in the common ruin between the two classes. His basic thesis is that the underclass has to awaken to its oppression, and it needs to go on the attack against the overclass that is oppressing it. So he says, in fact, that that conflict is characterized, in his own phrasing, in a word as oppressor versus oppressed. So anytime you see this oppressor versus oppressed dynamic, Karl Marx's hand is written all over that since at least the 1840s. It's not to say that oppression doesn't truly exist. Of course it does, and that it doesn't need to be resisted when it does exist, because it does. But it also means that the way that the Marxist worldview operates is to make it so that everything, the entire movement of history, is in fact characterized by one series of oppressions after another. Now, since Karl Marx didn't specify what is the nature of that necessary conflict, it's just oppressor versus oppressed, we could easily slide from economic oppression, which is what he was interested in and talked about through all of his works, into some other form of oppression, which could be identity politics, it could be racial, it could be sexual, it could be gender or sex, like feminism looks at. So there are many different dimensions in which the oppressor versus oppressed conflict can be analyzed. And that gives you the doorway to critical race theory. Just to skip to the punchline, critical race theory is what happens when you take Karl Marx's apparatus, his read of how history is organized and what the role of mankind in history is, and you apply it through the lens of race. What you get is critical race theory. So race Marxism is a fitting term. What he describes in the second chapter of the Communist Manifesto, which is in essence really just 2 short chapters long, it's not a very long book in its pure essence, is that the way that you are going to solve the problem of capitalism is that you're going to assert something called communism. And he says that the communism can be summarized in a single sentence, which is the abolition of private property. And the key feature of private property that makes it private property, that makes it private, that makes it a problem for Karl Marx, is that you have something called the fundamental right to exclude. In other words, if it's my property, if this is my cell phone, then it's not your cell phone, and you don't have any right to take it from me. And if it's your glass of water, then I have no right to take that from you. And so this fundamental right to exclude is central to the idea. Karl Marx thinks that the world will be a better place when we abolish private property. The problem in essence, though, is that human beings like to own private property. We like to work in the world and carve out a bit of our own and to feel proud of what we've earned and to enjoy what we've earned. So this fundamentally conflicts with human nature to say that we're going to abolish private property, say by state force. So Karl Marx, a few years before he wrote the Communist Manifesto, explained what he actually means by this. He actually has a different vision than the mere abolition of private property, the destruction of private property. It's in fact the transcendence, he calls it, of private property. He says that communism, rightly understood, is not merely abolishing private property, which he calls crude communism, which he says is vulgar and will devolve into a very low standard of life and a lot of ugly competition. Instead, it's this higher level thing. He says it's the positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement and a return of man to his human nature, which is social. So the idea of Marxism is actually religious. The idea is to transform human beings, not to want to have a bit of their own, not to want to earn and keep what they've earned, but rather to become fully, purely what he called species beings. Social animals who live entirely for the species. So the idea of Marxism is a fundamental spiritual transformation of all human beings. In practice, that doesn't work. You can't proselytize to people and convince them that they should own nothing and be happy. So instead, they create a state apparatus that's going to force people to go along with this, and that's where the formal abolition of private property comes in. We have all of this reproduced in critical race theory. This whole idea that private property is the problem. In 1993, a woman named Cheryl Harris wrote a paper called Whiteness as Property. So critical race theory regards whiteness as a kind of cultural property that white people assign to themselves in order to fundamentally exclude people of other races, and especially blacks, from the full standing in society. Now, this wasn't written in 1953. It was written in 1993. When this is kind of not what people are seeing. You have Oprah Winfrey, you have all of these, Michael Jordan, black athletes, black TV stars, black millionaires and billionaires all around, black leaders, and this is absolute nonsense, in other words, by the time that she's writing this. But she says that whiteness is a kind of cultural property that operates according to the bourgeois standards of private property that Karl Marx laid out. And so you have this repetition in critical race theory of this essential project of communism, which is to abolish whiteness, which is what you hear from critical race theorists and critical whiteness theorists ever since. Also, this idea of a fundamental transformation of yourself through criticism and self-criticism comes into play with critical race theory as well. The idea now is not to become a class-conscious proletarian who's going to seize the means of production, economic production, and transform the world. The idea now is that you're going to become a racially conscious anti-racist who's going to seize the means of social and cultural production between the races and transform the world. But the idea is the same. The goal is the same, a fundamental spiritual transformation through Marxist analysis and critique in order to change who we are is at the bottom of this. And this idea is just as destructive, whether it's taking place in the racial domain or whether it's taking place in the economic domain or whether it's taking place in the sexual domain under queer theory or feminism or any other. So you have this exact reproduction of the ideas now transferred out of class and into race. Marx's ideas, though, did not actually take off from Karl Marx. Karl Marx was not very successful at implementing his ideas. He caused some trouble. He got himself kicked out of a number of European countries, ended up lodged up in London, where they were very tolerant and allowed him to stay until he died. He's buried in Highgate Cemetery in London. I visited his grave myself. He could not make communism happen. But in the 1910s, you had the Bolsheviks in Russia, and this is where the next chapter in the CRT story really takes place. This is a piece of history we haven't talked much about for those of you that are familiar with the discussion about critical race theory. In 1913, Joseph Stalin was sent by Lenin to Austria to study how the Austrian Empire was dealing with the fact that it had many different people groups, ethnic groups, under one empire. And he wrote his only real theoretical work while he was in Austria. It's called Marxism and the National Question. And in Marxism and the National Question, Joseph Stalin laid out a program that in Russian is called korenizatsiya. Korenizatsiya means putting down roots. What korenizatsiya we call today is DEI. The Russian word means put down roots, but we call it DEI because the program, as it got adopted by the Soviet Union in the 1920s and was implemented as official policy, sought not to create something that we call equity today, but to create what the Russians called actual equality, which is exactly the same thing. It's equality that goes beyond economic equality and into ethnic equality and into individual social equality, so that every human being would be considered completely equal within the Russian Federation or the Soviet Union. It used a program that in Russian is called raznobratsiya, which means diversity, in order to accomplish its goals. Lenin said that that means diversity in it's diversity in form, but identity in content. In other words, it doesn't matter whether you're a Georgian, it doesn't matter if you're a Ukrainian, it doesn't matter if you're a Russian. We're going to have outward diversity, but inwardly we're all going to be the same. We're all going to be Soviets. And the program of korenizatsiya worked exactly like what we call inclusion. The idea was to go to these different regional areas, these ethnic regional areas like Ukraine or like Georgia or Estonia, and to tell them that they should have their own self-determination as a nation. But of course, what they're set against is actually the Russians. The Russian culture is being imposed upon them by what they called great power chauvinism. Great power chauvinism was taking the form of Russian chauvinism, or the great Russian chauvinism, and it needed to be resisted. And the true leaders of somewhere like Ukraine would be the ones who resisted that the most and identified the most with socialism. They were then brought in as Soviets to work in local councils, in regional councils, and eventually in Moscow. This was the world's first, as it's been described, affirmative action empire, and its protocol was exactly what we call DEI. What's fruit was exactly what you would expect. By the end of the 1920s, the Soviet Union was in ethnic strife and disarray. It was falling apart, and the iron fist of Stalin came down with a new program called Russification, at which point they were going to make everybody Russian. So it didn't matter what your ethnicity was anymore, now you're going to be Russian, and we're going to have unity in form all over again. Despite the fact that the korenizatsiya program failed, except to divide and conquer and elevate commissars from the different regions, and to create people who couldn't be challenged because it would be great Russian chauvinism, which sounds an awful lot like white supremacy, to challenge them, it got imported into China under Mao Zedong. They imported this program exactly into communist China. They called it Combat Han Chauvinism. So the Han race in China was the dominant race, and Han chauvinism was the attempt to make all Chinese people have to conform to Han standards, which sounds an awful lot like white supremacy culture and critical race theory, which tries to force everybody to live up to white standards. The Smithsonian famously put out a graphic explaining what white supremacy culture is, and it's just a set of virtues that everybody should aspire to, like being on time to work and things like that. This program came, and I'll explain how in just a moment, this program came from the Maoists into the United States by way of the critical theorists at Columbia and other advanced colleges or high-rated colleges in the United States, following the Cultural Revolution in China. So the same program was used in the Soviet Union, it was then used in China, it was then imported into the United States, and the offshoot of this becomes both intersectionality, and downstream from that, we end up with critical race theory. So that story on this side of the pond, it was that Marxism wasn't working in Europe either. It worked in the Soviet Union, it worked in China, where they had peasant societies they could conquer on promises of bread and land. It didn't work in industrial societies like the United States or Germany or the UK or France. And so what they ended up doing was trying to figure out how to transform the culture to be able to absorb Marxist ideas and Marxist revolution. And this became called cultural Marxism, headed by a man originally but called Antonio Gramsci, who said that the way that we transform the society is by going into the cultural producing institutions and changing them from within with new values. Those values might be diversity or inclusion, for example. And so what those values, or what those institutions, I should say, were that Gramsci said to target were primarily, he said, religion, family, education, media, and law. Critical race theory was primarily, in its beginnings, interested in law, and then very quickly after in education. Then it spread into the others, especially into media, and was able to do a mass propaganda campaign over the last couple of decades in the United States. The critical theorists were offshoots from not just the cultural Marxist program, but also this Institute for Social Research, or the Frankfurt School in Germany. This arose in the 1920s, and it was trying to find a path for Europe to go to Marxism like the Soviet Union had gone by bloody revolution under the Bolsheviks. And their goal was, again, to figure out how to do cultural transformation in line with what Antonio Gramsci had taught. But then Hitler took power in 1933, so these guys had to run, being mostly of Jewish heritage, had to run out of Germany as quickly as they could, and they were brought by the Fabian Socialist Society of London to first Geneva and then eventually the United States at Columbia University, where they set up shop and then disseminated to other elite universities through the United States. Their idea was to criticize culture on its own terms, how culture is produced, and to start, as Herbert Marcuse eventually put it in the 1960s, to start to try to find a way to get around the fact that the proletariat would not be located in the working class any longer. Instead, what he said is what we need to look at are identity politics. We need to look at the racial minorities and sexual minorities, the outsiders, and we need to radicalize them, and we need to radicalize them using the students in the universities whom we can reach. And we're going to bring to them this theory of liberation, of Marxist liberation, and we're going to train them up and have them take that message to, as he phrased it, the ghetto populations, where they would be located not just in important city centers, but near financial districts as well, where they could cause mayhem. Obviously, this is a recipe for disaster. But downstream from this, we end up getting the critical legal theory program, because this is critical theory that they developed here in the United States. The critical legal theory program developed in the 1970s in our law schools. It was not critical race theory, and in fact, not until the late or mid-1980s, 1985 or thereabouts, did they finally have a group of people who we would consider to be critical race theorists today show up at their big annual conference. They demanded to be able to have a panel. When they got on their panel, they did what you might expect if you're familiar with critical race theory. They sat on their panel and said that everybody in the critical legal studies movement was racist, which caused a bunch of progressive left-leaning lawyers to get at each other's throats. I'm not racist. Yes, you are. Everybody's in a huge fight. The critical legal studies movement more or less fell apart within a few years. And in 1989, you have the first meeting of the critical race theorists, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, meeting in a convent off of the University of Wisconsin at Madison campus, as they phrased it themselves, an odd setting for a bunch of Marxists. And Kimberly Crenshaw is credited with naming critical race theory and founding critical race theory alongside her mentor at Harvard, Derek Bell. And what Kimberly Crenshaw argued was that it was a bunch of critical theorists who were interested in racial justice and a bunch of racial justice advocates who used critical theory. So the name just made sense, critical race theory. So it's a direct derivative of the Marxist critical theory that the Herbert Marcuse Frankfurt School, Antonio Gramsci, back to Karl Marx line had produced. And what Marcuse had introduced was much of what he had learned from studying China, including their combat Han chauvinism program, which was the Korenizatsiya of the Soviet Union, repurposed in another context. And this was what developed the ideas that we hear in critical race theory, whether it's Derek Bell's interest convergence theory, that a great power, like white power, only helps people in a minority group when it's to their mutual benefit, that they never do something because it's the right thing to do, but only when there's interests converging. Whether it's the idea, like I already said, from Cheryl Harris of whiteness as property, or whether it's like Gloria Ladson-Billings in 1995 publishing Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education and publishing the first paper ever on what we call the other CRT, culturally relevant teaching, or culturally relevant pedagogy. So these characters in the 1990s had the interest now of pushing this critical race theory they had developed out of the critical legal studies coup that they ran in the 80s. They had the interest of pushing that into every institution they could reach. Law, they worked on very hard to maintain and expand affirmative action. thus instituting our DEI apparatus that we have today. In education, they pushed as hard as they possibly could to embed this deeply in our schools. Again, starting in 1995, there are papers moving it into our education system, even though here today in 2025, we still hear people say it's not taught in our schools. 30 years later, it certainly is. And they moved into the, like I said, the media industry as well. They worked very hard to get into media studies in order to create critical race criticisms of how media was portrayed so that they could move critical race themes through television, through music, through movies, and every other form of entertainment and news. And what we saw primarily was this erupt, this 20-year project since the late 1990s into the early 2020s. We saw this erupt when George Floyd died in 2020, at which point they launched their own CRT-based cultural revolution on America. And for many months, our cities were ransacked by rioters and looters and fires, and nobody was quite sure what to do, but everybody became introduced to this topic of critical race theory very quickly. So that's a brief history of critical race theory from Karl Marx in the 1840s to the riots of George Floyd in 2020, and hopefully the next chapter that we can tell is the end of critical race theory in America.
Thank you, James. We just learned about the Marxist roots of critical race theory and how it took root and evolved in our country right up through the 1980s and 90s. In 1989, our next speaker was just finishing her PhD in political science from the University of North Carolina and received tenure as an associate professor at Princeton University. In 1999, she became a professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University. She was immersed in academia right at the time our universities were becoming what we now call woke. And those universities were pushing their theories beyond the campuses and into mainstream America and further into our children's K-12 classrooms. In 2015, Vanderbilt students tried to cancel her over her conservative views. In 2017, she retired from Vanderbilt saying, "I will not miss what American universities have allowed themselves to become." I'm honored to introduce Dr. Carol Swain. Born into abject poverty in rural Southwest Virginia, Dr. Carol Swain, a high school dropout, went on to earn 5 degrees, holding a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and an MSL from Yale. She also earned early tenure at Princeton and full professorship at Vanderbilt, where she was a professor of political science and a professor of law. Today, she is a sought-after cable news contributor, a best-selling author, a prominent national speaker, and an entrepreneur. She is the recipient of 3 presidential appointments, cited 3 times by the U.S. Supreme Court, an award-winning political scientist. She has authored or edited 13 published books. Some of them are listed in the recommended reading section of the M4L CRT toolkit. She's an expert on civil rights, critical race theory, American politics, evangelicalism, and race relations. She is the founder and CEO of Carol Swain Enterprises, Real Unity Training Solutions, and her nonprofit, Be the People. Tonight, Dr. Swain will discuss the evolution of critical race theory that she witnessed in academia, how it spilled into our children's classrooms, how it affected her, what she saw it doing to our country, and where she thinks it's going next. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Carol Swain.
Well, that's a great introduction, but what I'm going to actually talk about today is civil rights and how it morphed into DEI and CRT. And I'm also going to say that for those of us who have been in the trenches fighting critical race theory and DEI, I think that we've reached a moment where we can celebrate for a while, because there are changes that are taking place in the country as we speak. I will talk about President Trump's executive order abolishing DEI in the federal government, but also 60 years of affirmative action. And so it's a new day, and whether or not we seize the opportunities that are before us depends a lot on us and our knowledge. But certainly anyone who has followed Moms for Liberty and read James Lindsay's books and heard his lectures, you're experts. And so give yourself really applause because we've been in the trenches for a while and it's bringing forth results. And again, the civil rights movement started off with very noble goals, and it sort of morphed into the DEI and the CRT, or it adopted it. It evolved, but we saw it impact our lives in ways that I don't think most people anticipated. Communism and civil rights are intertwined, and you may wonder how, but during the Cold War, which took place between 1947 and 1991 until the fall of the Soviet Union, black Americans, because of the segregation in the South and the racism that many blacks experienced, the Soviet Union was able to use propaganda and the Communist Party. I mean, they were deeply embedded in the civil rights movement. And when you see the film Uncle Tom 2, it will be eye-opening for a lot of people who didn't realize that when you have Dr. King, you have the civil rights movement, you have these noble goals, you have people working together across racial, ethnic, and religious lines, you also had the communists. They had a vision, they saw an opportunity, and they were right there. And they focused on the contradictions between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and how blacks were treated. And the 1960s, I would argue we got a lot of things right. And when the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, it ended or it prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, sex, national origin. And so that was a high point for America, but it didn't last very long. But during this time that we were passing civil rights laws in the 1960s, we became equal under the law. Legal forms of discrimination were pretty much abolished in the United States. And so we got those things right. 1964, we had the Civil Rights Act passed. 1965, the Voting Rights Act. Most people don't include this one, but I'll throw it in. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act that got rid of racial quotas from certain countries. And then the 1968 Open Housing Act. And I feel that that Open Housing Act resulted in the situation that we have today. I can live anywhere I can afford to live. I can't afford to live in Belmead, Nashville. But if I could afford to live there, I would be treated very well. And I think across America that people that can afford to live in particular areas, they get along pretty well. During the 1960s, there were some notable individuals as well as groups that were involved in the unrest. And for many of you, you're too young to have witnessed what took place in the 1960s. And it would be worth your while to just go back and learn about the Weather Underground, learn about the protest movements that took place and just the chaos. Some people would say that the world went to, hell in a handbasket? I always get those expressions wrong, but everything was turned upside down in the 1960s. And Dr. King, he came on the scene in 1955. I was born in 1954. And he was the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Council. And that organization was an organization, just like many of the organizations of the 60s, they were always infiltrated with people that were more communist than Christian. Malcolm X, King preached nonviolence. Malcolm X was associated with, for many people, violence. He certainly advocated self-defense, and he encouraged blacks, someone, if he hits you, you hit him back, arm yourself, fight back. And he was assassinated in 1965, King in 1968. And then Stokely Carmichael, he was the one that brought us the phrase Black Power. And so he organized in the South. He was a part of the student student nonviolent coordinating committee, but they were very much into organization, and he eventually changed his name, and he was from Trinidad, but he was very powerful during the 1960s with his ideas, and he co-authored a book with a political scientist named George Hamilton on Black Power and what it meant. The 1960s, you had protest movements, the women's movement, when women started burning their bras and they stopped wearing makeup and they uglified themselves. And we had the beginning of the LGBTQ movement with the Stonewall incident in New York, the environmental movement, the anti-Vietnam War, and then the rise of the hippies. And so there were all these movements, and clearly the Marxists were very much involved, and you had professors on university campuses that were Marxists. They were Marxist professors, and when I started graduate school, there were professors who called themselves Marxists. But as I stayed in academia for 28 years, there were fewer institutions that had professors who called themselves Marxists. And what I saw happen was that the Marxism became so much a part of the culture that it was everywhere. You didn't have to call yourself Marxist because it was integrated into the fabric of the institution. And I can also say that during my time in academia, I started off as a congressional scholar, and so I was very much focused on policy, real world politics, and there would always be seminars on critical race theory, critical, legal theory, postmodernism, and so all of these philosophies were all around me, and I didn't pay enough attention to it. And it was only after President Obama was elected that I actually started studying Marxism and communism, because it was impacting my life in ways that I never anticipated. And so it was around me at Princeton. It was around me, a little bit University of North Carolina, but I wasn't paying attention. But by the time we get to the 2000s, not only was I paying attention, but a lot of other people were paying attention. The 1960s, we're still in the 1960s. You saw the breakdown of the culture. Prayer in school, 1962, prayer was taken out of school. And it's much like a strategy that we see used today, that a parent, with that child, protested a very innocent prayer. If I had that prayer before me and I read it, it's so harmless, like, dear Lord, protect our teachers and protect us. It didn't say Jesus or anything like that, but that prayer, the Supreme Court used that to take prayer out of school. 1963, Bible reading was prohibited. We had the riots of the 1960s, and what was very fascinating about the riots of the 1960s, that they really started on the heels of the passage of the Civil Rights Act. They became increasingly more violent, and so at the time when conditions were improving for blacks, that was when we got more and more riots. And when the rioters were apprehended, they were not, the inner city people necessarily. There were, college educated people, just like today, that were in there, middle class people that were involved in those riots and burning down communities. And what was very striking to a lot of people was that black people were burning down their own communities, they burned down their own stores, and that didn't seem to make a lot of sense. It's been explained to me that it made sense because if they had tried to burn down the white stores, that they would have been, dead on arrival. So the riots of the 1960s, we saw the breakdown in law and order. And when Richard Nixon ran for president, he ran on law and order. And the progressives told us that that was a code word for black, anti-black. We saw the breakdown of families, no-fault divorce in the 1960s, and we saw non-discrimination morph into racial preferences. And what's so interesting about this, when the 1964 Civil Rights Act passed, that very next year was when Johnson signed the executive order instituting affirmative action. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 never got a chance to get off the ground before racial preferences were instituted. And I could talk about some of the Marxists, and James has mentioned some of them, but the communists were so much, their goals were so much involved in things that were taking place in American society, and there were people who sound an alarm. And two of these in particular, Joseph McCarthy. You've all heard of McCarthyism. Well, we know now that Joseph McCarthy was right. There were Marxists everywhere, embedded in our government, embedded in our society. And Cleon Skousen, who wrote The Naked Communists. And if you read the pages in the Naked Communists, pages 246 through 249, there are maybe 43 or something like that communist goals. And many of these things have already happened. And this was, The Naked Communists was published in 1958, but in 1963 those goals were read into the Congressional Record. Some of them were, the first one, 15, capture one or both political parties in the United States. And we know that happened, that they captured the Democratic Party, and they're making inroads on the Republican Party. And they talked about using the courts to weaken basic American institutions by claiming that practices violated civil rights, get control of the schools, use them as a transmission belt for socialism and communist goals, infiltrate the press, present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy, eliminate prayer in school. We could go down the list, and you would see that I believe it was 44 goals that they pretty much accomplished all of them with the help of Republican and Democrat presidents. And Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals became the Bible of the progressive left. And his strategies included deception, infiltration, and manipulation. And think about the infiltration. Think about when you, people who are conservative, who are Christian, they're often Republicans, and that you find people in your party that engage in activities or they support legislation, and you wonder, how could that be? Why would they do that? Well, they've infiltrated your party. They've infiltrated your organization. There isn't a meaningful, powerful university that there is not a meaningful, powerful institution that the left would not infiltrate. And I don't have time to say, everything I'd like to say, but one thing I tell young people is that we can use these strategies to our advantage, that we can infiltrate progressive organizations. We can work our way to the top, and when we get to the top, we can institute our values in the same way that they have done. Some of Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals had to do with ridicule is man's most potent weapon, and you see a lot of ridicule of the president and various people. One of them had to do with isolating people. I'm not seeing it very clear here, but how you would target one person and you just go and you go after them and after them and after them until you weaken them. That was a Saul Alinsky rule. And so because of people like Saul Alinsky, who sort of trained the radical left, and you think about the people that came out of the 1960s, many of them are running our colleges and universities, and that's why there's so much chaos there. And I'm going to shift from this back to affirmative action. And affirmative action, again, it sort of morphed into first the DEI and the critical race theory, and I call DEI affirmative action on steroids. And it was Kennedy that did the first executive order in 1960. That was needed. Lyndon Johnson, the second one in 1965, that was not needed. That was the one that brought in the preferential treatment. That was the one that basically violated the Civil Rights Act. It violated the Equal Protection Clause. I have been saying this for years, and now everyone is saying it. At least, President Trump is saying it, and the people that are getting rid of DEI, they're saying it. But from the very beginning, it violated the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause. And then Richard Nixon, not to be left out of this, he did his executive order, and he put in place the affirmative action offices, within businesses, and also the first quota program, where you had the Philadelphia plan. And with affirmative action evolving, its original purpose was supposed to help people, the past and present, to combat past and present discrimination, but very quickly it morphed into something more than combating discrimination against blacks. By the 1970s, there were like 5 groups included, and you got the racial preferences, the quotas, the identity politics, and then the DEI. And first it was just about diversity. And I can tell you with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which I argue that I benefited from tremendously, was that there was a focus on non-discrimination, outreach, and equal opportunity. And equal opportunity is not the same as equity, because with equity, that's equal outcomes. With equal opportunity, the emphasis was getting your foot in the door. Once you got your foot in the door, you had to prove yourself. And integration, the whole goal of civil rights was to bring people in. They would become a part of the whole. Whites and blacks and various kinds of people, men and women, would work together. With inclusion, it's about bringing in people that have strong group identity, and they maintaining those identities, not blending in. And so the CRT, critical race theory, and the DEI have worked hand in hand to discriminate against groups that are not protected. And so we saw a situation that we reached where if you were a healthy white male, you were just totally shut out. But if you belonged to a protected category, you got advantages. And if you look at the Biden administration, how they had so much diversity, LGBTQ diversity, as well as blacks and Hispanics and all kinds of groups, but these people were not qualified. They were not the best of their group. In fact, it was very harmful for blacks and Hispanics and gays and people that belong to those categories, because they all of a sudden they were in a situation where members of their group that were supposed to be representing them were in high profile positions, but they were not qualified. And it made it seem like anyone that's in a position of power, they got it because they belonged to a particular group. And so there was a tremendous lowering of standards, especially in recent years, and that has been what we've experienced. And DEI and CRT is not something that's ever worked. As James has explained, it's rooted in I call it neo-Marxism, but it's rooted in Marxism. It uses conflict to bring about change, and you will never get any kind of reconciliation. Forget racial reconciliation and healing. It can't come out of a conflict model. And that's, that should be common sense. You cannot get any kind of reconciliation out of conflict, but that's what DEI tried to do. President Trump, recently, since he was elected, he issued an executive order, and his executive orders, there were several. He abolished affirmative action. He overturned Johnson's 1965 affirmative action directive. He abolished DEI, and they have pretty much tried to move back to a society where you have the color blindness, where you have everyone equal under the law, our civil rights laws being enforced. And it will take a while for the changes to take place because it's so deeply embedded in our society, and you can expect a lot of resistance. That's always what happens. You get resistance. And what I have observed over my lifetime is that it was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that opened the doors for many people like me. And we got opportunities, and you had you could take advantage of them, or you didn't have to, but it was up to you what you did with that opportunity. And the conflict and controversy has always surrounded affirmative action. And with critical race theory, it became just so divisive when you divided society into oppressors and the oppressed, and the minorities were the oppressed and the whites were the oppressors. That was very divisive and so much against our civil rights laws. And critical race theory and DEI, it's always been incompatible with the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause and with our civil rights laws. And I firmly believe that we can have diversity without discrimination. I believe that we were moving in that direction. And during the time, the 2000s, before President Obama was elected, we thought we were becoming a post-racial society. There had been so much progress, and all of that was quickly turned around. And we can move back. We can turn things around. We have an opportunity now that affirmative action and DEI have been declared, dead on arrival. We have an opportunity to really fulfill the promise of America when it comes to our Constitution and our civil rights laws. And there are things that we can do. And some of those things is that we need to know the laws, we need to know our rights, and we need to be willing to stand up and fight for the things that we believe in, and to also fight for other people. Those of you in this room, you have knowledge, you're here. There are other people that need to be educated about these issues. But what I will leave you with is that this is a time where we can have tremendous optimism, because things seem to be headed in the right direction. So it's up to us what we make of all this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Swain. So, there's another aspect of critical race theory that we all watched on our TV screens in the summer of 2020, and some of us watched it in person. The rise of race rage in our country and violent protests and the advent of Black Lives Matter. Almost overnight, not only did many Democratic politicians take a knee in our nation's capital, but so did nearly every major American corporation, donating billions to BLM and committing to diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, all in the name of social justice. Witnessing all of this was our final speaker, Kevin McGary. Ministry leader, entrepreneur, author, and public speaker. He is the co-founder of Every Black Life Matters. He leads a group of proactive individuals focused on developing innovative solutions to contemporary socio-political problems. He delivers lectures, training sessions, and workshops aimed at addressing some of today's most challenging problems. He is also an accomplished author with 8 published books. His latest releases, DEI in 3D and Freed to be Servant and Slave, offer insightful critiques of cultural schemes that he argues undermine American principles, traditions, and biblical truths. He holds a PhD in Christian ministry leadership and management and maintains an active role in supporting pastors and ministry leaders worldwide. Please give a warm welcome to Kevin McGary.
Well, we all saw the BLM riots and all of that kind of stuff. And I got to tell you, we went through that, and it was really perplexing for probably everybody here, for everybody listening. I have to give a special thanks to the doctors who went before me, Dr. Carl Swain and Dr. James Lindsay, for doing such a great job at exposing the sort of Marxist schemes that the underpinnings of what we went through. But the reality is that we went through some stuff, and it was just like, what in the world did we step into? I mean, we recognized what happened with George Floyd, and then all of a sudden, it just like all hell broke loose. And you know, we were asked to bow and kneel and bark. You know, I mean, you know, hey, bark. You know, and we had people kissing feet, and it's like, what in the world? What this is America. What are we doing? You know, so. A lot of us don't really haven't really even precisely connected the dots as to how did we make such a radical turn so quickly. And so I want to, you know, the whole idea behind Moms for Liberty and helping parents and practitioners to understand what's happening with CRT and DEI is that we give you really a comprehensive view. So all of the historical view that the doctors talked about with Marxism and the social constructs that have played into this is profound. But the other part of the view as well that I really want us to get a good grasp on is the fact that wokeism is in and of itself racist and supremacist. Now, a lot of us won't know how to necessarily, we know, we can intuit that, but we don't know how to make that argument. But for parents who are trying to teach our children correctly, how to observe these things correctly from a cultural historical context, we need to be able to articulate this from the perspective that they could see it and that we could really, you know, really see it. So I want to step back a little bit and go into how BLM, Black Lives Matter, were using, you know, while they're calling everyone associated, you know, white supremacist and racist, how they actually were in and of themselves using white supremacist or supremacist and racist tactics. And it fundamentally drives their entire narrative. So in order for me to do that, though, we have to connect some dots historically. Dr. Lindsay went back to Marx. I'm going to go back to Marx's mentor. Marx was a protege of Charles Robert Darwin. I'm going to even go back before that because we have to understand that the whole idea behind race and class, race classification, is completely a social construct. And not only that, but it's malevolent social construct, specifically designed to do what it's doing. And but so let's go back in history. From the Garden of Eden, we had tribalism. We had you know, strife between tribes. You know, you come in somebody's territory, you're going to get jacked. You had all kinds of issues, but it was mostly tribal. You know, ancient history, right? Then you come up to, let's say, the 1700s, and there was a gentleman by the name of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who said, look, you know, societies have evolved so much that we really need to try to sort of classify, you know, where, you know, demographically, so we could, you know, just have some kind of classification. He did it based on geography. So he did it based on the 5 most populated continents at the time. So he said Africa was Ethiopians, Europeans were Caucasians. These were broad characterizations, right? Then we had this gentleman come up in the early 1800s by the name of Charles Darwin. Now, here's one other thing about Johann Friedrich Blumenbach is he says, look, I've done the cranial cavity studies about all races and race classifications, and there was this thought that, hey, people in Ethiopia, the Africans, are different than everybody else. He says, I've done the cranial cavity research, and there is nothing cognitively or intellectually different than from Africans from any other race. He said that's settled science. the man who had the exact same pedigree as him came about in the 1800s, and his name was Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin actually, even though he had the exact same pedigree and all of the notes from Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, he decides he wants to posit his theory on evolution. And in order to do that, he had to sort of appease the aristocrats in Europe. And in order to do that, he basically posited that races are not, based on geography. Races are based on skin color, intellect, and other classifications. So he goes into, he says, look, first of all, there is no God. So this whole idea that, men are created equal and, God is not a respecter of person, that's all foolishness. He says, look, we whites, we fully evolved first, because remember, Charles Darwin, his theories of evolution, right? We fully evolved first. So because we fully evolved first, we are the cat's meow. And every other subsequent ethnicity that evolved after us is a variation of the theme that has some level of degradation. He says, you take a look at the blacks. He says, you see, they're still subhuman. They're still trying to evolve. They're tantamount to gorillas, apes, and savages. All of this is documented in my book, Woked Up. And all of this comes out of his book, The Descent of Man, his second book. So prior to Darwin making these audacious proclamations, there was no thought of men not being equal. Even though there was tribalism, there were, men were enslaving other men who would stumble into their territory and all this stuff in history. We had all of this going on, but we never had the idea that one human is superior over another. That idea did not exist whatsoever, scientifically or otherwise, until Darwin said there is no God, therefore whites, evolve first, everybody else afterwards, and we see this degradation of capacity with each subsequent ethnicity. That's where you get race classification. That's also the advent, if you think about this, of white supremacy. White supremacy did exist. Because Darwin says, look, we aristocrats here in Europe, we evolved first, baby. We're supreme. We are the supreme ethnicity, period. Every other ethnicity, and especially blacks, look, they're still subhuman. They're still trying to climb the evolutionary scale. And this is where we get racism. This is where it comes from. Because although we treated people differently who came from different areas that we didn't understand ancient history, but when we believe that somebody is innately inferior, yeah, we can treat it differently. Sure. Why not? They don't have the innate capability I have, so why can't we treat them differently? And this is the advent of racism. So, when you start taking a look at critical race theory, and you take a look at the Marxist schemes that really underpin that, you have to understand where all this comes from. It does come from Karl Marx's mentor, Charles Darwin. White supremacy, supremacy generally, and racism, race classification. And it basically infers that blacks are just subhuman and, therefore inferior. So this is where all of this comes from. Now, what was interesting with BLM is they were using supremacy sort of in reverse, because they were saying, look, we do believe in supremacy, but blacks are supreme. You guys, And we had some guilted, white brothers and sisters that were saying, well, I feel so bad. Yeah, I saw it. And they say, okay, kiss the feet. And they kiss the feet, and then they bark, and they do all this other, roll over and do all this other kind of craziness. And the BLMers would say, yeah, you're still white, so no. You're irredeemably, there was nothing that anyone could do. Critical race theory infers that just because of the melanin or lack thereof, that you're irredeemably racist or you're supremacist. So it sort of turns this whole idea of supremacy on its head, in the sense that it doesn't, it borrows from Darwin in the sense that there is no, all men are created equal, and that men are different and innately inferior, but it turns it on its head by saying blacks are superior. I mean, it's kind of, so when you think about it, BLM and all of our Marxist, leftist, progressive friends who demand, DEI and CRT, they're actually borrowing from a false narrative of a social construct of the guy who actually, gave us supremacy and racism. I mean, and they're doing this to supposedly make everything equal and non-racist and anti-racist. I mean, the level of, contorted reality that we've all had to endure because of what's been going on, it's mind-blowing. What we want you parents, what we want you activists, what we want you practitioners to understand is that all of this did have a start point. And it's all a false narrative. We're all, God is not a respecter of persons. We do have a creator God, and he created us all equal. And if you believe in evolution, if you're an atheist, you believe in evolution in that way, then at some level you innately believe that, some races are innately inferior compared to others. So this is where we get into all of this racism stuff. What I want us to go away with is critical race theory guilts, shames, undermines the dignity of especially whites, but of everybody. It is it basically infers that especially whites, you're irredeemable. There's nothing you can do about it just because of skin color. Now, this skin color, as a DNA perspective, it's 1/10 of 1% or something like that between, people. And skin color is one of those minute traits or characteristics that we carry. And just because of lack of melanin, people are being castigated as permanently and perpetually racist, demonized, guilted, shamed, abused. And so this is what makes this so dangerous, right? Here's what I think that we should all. The other thing that it does is it says whites are all victimizers, whites are all oppressors, and blacks because of our lived experience, we're actually, we have the ability, we have special insights. And we have because of our special insights, we're the ones that everyone should be listening to. So you see how this is trying to sort of overcompensate, leveling the playing field for past grievances, and it's just ridiculous. What we all have to come to grips with is critical race theory in and of itself is racist. Anytime you see somebody and just based upon melanin or lack thereof, or just based on ethnicity, you characterize them, you castigate them, you demean them, you undermine their humanity, you're racist. And that is critical race theory. Here's some ideas. I want to give you some examples of that we can all just intuit in our own mind rhetorically. When people recover from prior addictions, we have family members that go through stuff, and let's say they left the recovery home, the addiction home, and they're back home now. It's everybody is incented to try to, bring them back into the fold, not hold their past alcoholism or drug addictions against them, but encourage them to be better, to be new. We give them basically give them a pass to be for rehab, right? That doesn't happen with CRT. CRT says, no. You're white, therefore you're guilty. There's nothing you can do. You're just jacked up, right? Even Gerber said, look, the white babies in the womb are white supremacists and racists. This is Gerber, the baby food. Another example. What was our universal American response when prisoners are released? Well, when prisoners are released, we say, look, hey, we should rehab them, give them a job, see, we don't trust them empirically in everything, but, we try to, with critical race theory, we don't do that, right? We say, no, there is no redemption. You're white. You're jacked up, we can't trust you. What was the American response with 9/11 hijackers? President Bush said, look, we're not going to hold this against all Islamists who have come here. These are just this couple of guys who did this to America. And it would be irresponsible for us as a nation to hold this against all Islamists. And yet, all whites, we're saying, should be guilted, should be dismissed, and just because of skin color. I'm drawing these distinctions so we could see clearly that in every other domain of our lives, we encourage redemption. We encourage that we don't hold people accountable for past sins or past things that have happened, except with critical race theory. With critical race theory, there is nothing that a person who has a lighter paint job than I do can do to feel better about themselves or to somehow absolve themselves from sins of others around them. It is fundamentally, supremely a racist scheme. And everyone should completely reject it, right? Bottom line, critical race theory is supremacist and racist. BLMers, the wokeism, all the woke people in the woke movement are supremacist and racist. There is a real connection there. It's unavoidable. It's just the way it is. When we come in with people like this, we should help them understand their history, a more accurate history, help them to understand the false narratives that they're carrying, and help bring them along so they can actually begin to think more clearer about, look, we're all just human beings. We're all one. There's no such thing as this, melanin and all of that being, making us innately superior or worse than another person. I hope this is helpful. I'm hopeful that we can help our children, practitioners, and teachers to learn more about sort of the roots and foundations of where all this craziness comes from. God bless you.
Thank you, Kevin. We are going to invite all of the participants, all the speakers, back to the stage. So we're just going to take 1 minute to reconfigure the stage. Be sure to formulate your questions. Think about what you want to ask this incredible lineup of speakers, and put that question in the chat. Also, at the top of the chat, there's a Ask Your Question feature, which makes it easier for us to find your questions. And we'll see you in about 1 to 2 minutes. All right, I'm sure that our in-studio audience and our online audience have some amazing questions for our speakers, so we'll get started. The first one is from online. Wendy asks, Dr. Swain, do you think that DEI actually ever benefited Black Americans? I can understand the need for affirmative action for the first generation, but is it helpful in any way now?
No, I don't think so. I think it lowered standards tremendously, and it undercut a lot of the gains that blacks had made over the decades. And diversity, equity, and inclusion, the Marxist part of it was all about division. All it did was to pit groups against one another, and it hurt racial and ethnic minorities who had accomplishments, because the people that have been put in front, center front, have been people who were and are incompetent.
Kevin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, can I, another data point for all of us to sort of take into consideration. Because of DEI, we almost had our current president assassinated. Because, you know, he had a 4'5", you know, female that was, and he's 6'3", trying to guard him, you know, when he was shot at. We had New Orleans FBI saying there is no terrorist attack on this terrorist New Year's Eve, while they were unfurling the ISIS flag in the background. What she was saying, it made her look ridiculous, you know, to Dr. Swain's point, and it just shows that these people are incompetent. We also had the DEI hire New Orleans police chief that said, oh, she didn't even know that they had the barriers to put out for the streets. So she was the DEI hire. Then we see DEI hires Karen Bass and Gavin Newsom. Yeah, Gavin Newsom is a DEI hire. He's because of his mental incapacities. They say, oh, well, he's a mentally, so yeah, it qualifies for DEI. So anyway, I'm from California, so I could use jokes like that. So anyway, so we saw the fires and the fire chiefs and the entire, LA Fire Department with all of their malfeasance as it relates to the fires in California. So DEI is absolutely, positively dangerous. It is dangerous for everybody. It not only robs the dignity of the person who's put in this position and they're incompetent and glaringly incompetent, but it's also dangerous for all those involved.
I want to say something too to add to your list. The Black Hawk helicopter pilot, they talk about how distinguished she was. She was in the top 20% of her class. As a university, 20% was not, something that you would tout that much. And with great inflation, I'm not sure what it means to be in the top 20%. And the young lady, I've heard that she had 450 hours of flying, 500 hours, but not enough to have been a captain. And you think about all those lives that were lost, including hers, for DEI, because she was a member of the LGBTQ community, and she was certainly promoted as part of the DEI.
And I can say from experience, 450 does not an experienced pilot make. You're still learning at that point. A question from Mary for Dr. Lindsay. You touched on Herbert Marcuse. Can you expound on his significance to CRT?
Yeah, I mean, if you had to name one person who's maybe most responsible for the legacy that became CRT, we don't get to give Kimberly Crenshaw. Here I'm taking it away from a black woman and giving it to a white man. We can't give this credit to Kimberly Crenshaw. We have to give it to Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse was the mover and the shaker of leftist politics in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. He was the leftist academic rock star. He wrote a book in 1964 called One-Dimensional Man, where he outlined many of these same ideas that I mentioned in my lecture. And this book sold 300,000 copies in its first year, which is a very large number of copies of books. Usually, for those of you who don't know about books, 5,000 copies is considered by your publisher to be a success story. 300,000 copies in a year is astronomical, and that's even back in the 1960s. So his influence was enormous, but probably the most direct influence he had, other than saying that we're now going to shift off of the working class as the basis for revolution and shift into the so-called ghetto population as the basis for the revolution, was that he also was PhD advisor to Angela Davis, who is one of the founding members and Marxists. In fact, she quit the Communist Party USA that she was a member of. I think she ran for either president or vice president as a Communist Party USA member. She quits the party because it, she said, was too conservative for her. She was taught by Herbert Marcuse. She was the disciple of his very radical Marxist and racial politics. And she went on to be extremely influential. When we talk about Kimberly Crenshaw creating critical race theory, and we talk about her naming intersectionality, in the papers in which she did that, she credits Angela Davis as being one of her major influences. So that's a direct impact of Herbert Marcuse's influence in the United States, trickling down to the creation, the specific creation of CRT and intersectionality. You also see this, that Angela Davis was involved in what was called the Combahee River Collective, which was a group of socialist, Marxist women, black feminists specifically. And that's really where the whole intersectional program began. Kimberly Crenshaw can be given plenty of credit. We know that there's lots of problems with plagiarism on the left in academia, don't we, Dr. Swain? But she can be given a lot of credit for coming up with these names, but the idea of intersectionality, which she first named in 1989 or 1991, this concept was already floating around in the radical circles that she was running in by 1977 with the Combahee River Collective Manifesto. And again, the Combahee River Collective Manifesto was written by radical activists who were direct inheritors of Herbert Marcuse's radical politics of the 1960s and 1970s.
And I want to say something else. He wrote an essay in 1965. I believe the title was what is Repressive Tolerance. And it outlined really the basis and theory for the cancel culture that we have today, where the left shuts down anything that's traditional. It was all laid out in that essay. And I think that was significant, and that was 1 year after the Berkeley free speech movement.
Just for clarity, what Herbert Marcuse said in that essay specifically was that he called his program liberating tolerance. That was the answer to the right-wing repressive tolerance he was fighting against. And what he said was this definition, this is the definition he actually gives, means extending tolerance to movements from the left and withdrawing tolerance from movements from the right. That simple. Well, if it's leftist, we'll tolerate it. If it's against leftism, it shall not be tolerated. And that's the world that we've lived in since 1965 from the left, increasing to the point where it's been something you can't even resist, irresistible since the last 5 years.
And Robin, I'd like to say that for myself, I was on the cutting edge of being a victim of the cancel culture before we knew what to call it.
And we appreciate your courageous stand on that. Next question is from Joseph, and I'm sure this is a question that is on a lot of parents' minds. How do I know if CRT is being taught in our schools? Do I have to read every book in the library? Give me an example of CRT in curriculum. Whoever wants to take it.
I'll start. The fundamental thing that CRT boils down to is exactly what Karl Marx said on the opening page of the Communist Manifesto. It is the conflict between classes, in a word, oppressor versus oppressed. So if you have materials in your kid's classroom that pit races in an oppressor versus oppressed context, CRT is in your children's school. It is being practiced in your children's school like a religion would be practiced. And your children are being brought up in it. You don't have to read all of the content. If you do read some of the content, that's fine, and you may see it directly, but you'll see it in your children. You'll see it in the fruit. If your children are starting to engage in this kind of racial conflict theory where it's, you know, well, so-and-so is an oppressor, or did people who look like us do awful things, should we feel guilty, or they're expressing that kind of guilt, you can bet that this racial idea of CRT is being taught in their schools, and then you can start to follow up accordingly.
And I would say that what some people don't know is that people who are steeped in critical race theory and gender theory, they have published books and articles. They've written, storybooks for children. And you can tell through your children, because if you have a little white child, son or daughter, and they are coming home and they're ashamed of who they are, they're ashamed of their culture, and you can see the discomfort. No child should be shamed. And at one time we were taught that one of the worst things you could do to a child was to shame that child. But doing the critical race theory, when they became really aggressive with their theories, it was okay to shame little white kids.
And a word on that, here in Williamson County, Tennessee, we ran into CRT embedded in curriculum, and we knew it by the fruits. There was a young boy in the 2nd grade who had biracial parents, and he said to his mom one night, "I'm ashamed to be white." So right then and there, we knew that critical race theory was present in the 2nd grade somewhere. And the parents banded together to read all of the books. But not only did we have to read all the books to find the examples of some of these books were really too dark and too age inappropriate, but what you had to do was go look at the teacher's manuals and say, how are they presenting this book? How is it scripted into the day? And what are they focusing on? Down to, in many weeks, they would have spelling words that the kids are having to memorize how to spell, but it would be racism, oppressed, oppression, just very charged words like that. So it can be hard to find, but I think Dr. Lindsay is correct, is you'll know it by its fruits.
Well, some of it is in your face, because the 1619 project, when it first came out, it was immediately in over 3,000 schools, and I haven't, kept track of how many schools it's in, and so that's one way that it is present before children. And Black Lives Matter, they have their own curriculum, they have videos, they have children's books. And so there are school districts that would adopt those materials thinking that they're sensitizing the children and they're doing a public good. So it's not going to be that you're teaching the theories that are on a college level. They have taken the ideas and sort of distilled them down to a child's level. And they're very skilled. They know exactly what they're doing.
Right, and there's some also supplementary curriculums that are not accessible via FOIA or in the administrative offices, because they're just YouTube videos, and one of those examples would be Brain Pop, which pushed a lot of the pro-BLM stuff early on. Shelley asks, I am presenting in a week to our high school reconsideration of materials committee meeting on English 2 material that is all on BLM, oppression, and CRT. What is the best one-liner I can throw at them? I'm going to give this one to Kevin because he had quite a few.
They're racist and supremacist! Exclamation point. No, you know, the best one-liner is look, they're using false narratives to actually cause division. These divisions are you know, purposeful in the sense that they're, you know, underpinned with Marxist ideology, and there's nothing redemptive from that other than to know where they come from, and they are racist and supremacist in that regard.
And if you don't want to say they're racist and they're supremacists, I think that if they are presented, the materials are presented in such a way that it's clearly discriminatory and it's inflammatory and it's saying all these things about white people, it's probably violating, you know, something about the Civil Rights Act or the equal protection. And so if you can, in a situation involving a school system, this kind of discrimination is on its way out the door. And I believe that once the Department of Education figure out what they're going to do, they're going to prohibit certain types of materials. And so if this is taking place in a school or a classroom, then that school or classroom risks a situation where some parent, maybe one of you all, will complain and they will have to take it out.
Richard asks, how do we get our woke school board members to understand what you have so well presented?
You know something, I think we go back to the Constitution, we go back to the Declaration of Independence, and those documents ought to be required.
Yes.
And, you know, if we are talking about a Christian school, because some of them lean towards woke, the golden rule, treat other people the way you want to be treated. And no one wants to be discriminated against because of the color of their skin or their sex or even sexual orientation. No one wants to be discriminated against. And so if we treat other people the way we want to be treated, then there are certain things that we ought not to do. We ought not, be doing.
I would encourage, you know, getting the doctor's books. You have resources that you'll be, so get the books that are resource linked. And my book, Woked Up, I go into a lot of Darwin and stuff there and give you a little bit more of that history. If that, I don't even know if that's part of the resource, but you may want to link there. But it's Woked Up, W-O-K-E-D up. And that'll just reading more will give you more context and give you the ability to sort of stand firm without having to sort of cower to these, you know, these leftist progressives are, you know, they come across pretty aggressive, and so you have to be able to stand firm, and the only way you're going to do that is to arm yourself with more information and actual knowledge about where this stuff comes from.
Well, some of the things that I think are important is for white people to realize that there were always whites fighting against slavery, and there were white philanthropists that donated money to build the first schools for the newly freed slaves. There were white philanthropists that created the Tuskegee Institute that founded the historically black colleges and universities. And if you look at history, trillions of dollars have been spent trying to address the past and present effects of slavery. And there are colleges and universities in parts of the country that never discriminated against blacks. So they have black alumni going back to the 1800s. And so if you actually knew history, there's a lot, you know, that doesn't get discussed, but it's very positive about white Americans. And the civil rights movement was a time in America where whites, blacks, and Asians, people came together across racial, ethnic, and religious lines, and they fought for non-discrimination and the Civil Rights Act.
I'll just piggyback off of what Kevin said. I think it's extremely important to realize that, your school board members are people. You may have forgotten that. And you're people, which means the reason that you're listening today and the reason that you're taking in this information and understanding it and asking a question like, how do we get our school board members to understand this, is that you've gone through a process by which your eyes were open to what we're dealing with. You had a learning process of your own, like Kevin was saying. I strongly encourage not just using the resource guides provided by M4LU, but also make your own resource guides. Think through, what was it that opened your eyes to understanding what critical race theory is as, say, an everyday parent that has a child in the school system? What 5 or 6, whether it's articles or books or podcasts, can you recommend, and then make it as easy as possible for that busy person to access that material? Don't make them go hunt it down. Give them, if you send them an email with active links that take them straight to the content with a short description of why they should engage with that particular content in your opinion. If you want to give them a book, do what you can to give them a physical copy of the book in person. Schedule lunch or something, buy them lunch, give them a book. This will cost you, about $50, and you can actually make a gigantic difference in the level of education that they have on the issues that are important to you. And I think that this is an extremely important behavior if you want to try to up the understanding level of our elected representatives and elected officials, or even appointed officials. So take that, and by the way, judges also. So take that very seriously, I think, is a useful approach.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, next question from Wendy. I see private schools spending money on DEI trainings rather than on scholarships. That's crazy. Dr. Swain, can you comment on the hypocrisy around the DEI industrial complex?
Well, I can tell you it's like a billion-dollar industry, and what's really disheartening is that there are many Christian colleges and universities and private academies that are engaging in this. And so you may think your child is great, they're in this, elite school, but I guarantee you most of those schools are doing DEI and CRT at some level. And I think the guilt for them is that if it is a expensive school, there will be very few racial and ethnic minorities, so all the whites are suffering from white guilt. And that's part of the problem. And so what was the question?
About
the hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's there, but again, it's just white people have been guilted out, and it was a long time before white people got their voices, and before Moms for Liberty, before that group organized, I would give talks and I would say, what's wrong with you white people? Right. Your children are being shamed. They're coming home crying, and you're not speaking up.
Right.
And then the moms. They organized, and I guess the dads were somewhere behind them. But for the most part, their children suffered for a while before the moms organized and spoke up about what was taking place.
What I'll tell you is any communist program is a method of trying to replace competence and merit with obedience to the party politics, being able to repeat the lines. So what that means in practical terms is that it's always grifters. You're always going to have some grifter who's going to show up and teach everybody the proper party lines.
Stop talking about Ibram Kendi.
Yeah, $10 million.
Robin DiAngelo.
Yeah, $10 million at Boston University he got. Right? And so you're going to have these grifters who come in to meet the need. And what they're teaching you isn't something that's meant to make anything better. It's to teach you obedience to the party politics, because it's no longer whether or not you can do the job, which is exactly what you want in a society that's going to succeed, exactly what you want your children to aspire to. It's now going to be, can they obey this complicated, arcane set of rules that the party has set up? And so what you've got to understand is that the hypocrisy has on top of it an entire industry, billion-dollar industry, with a B, billion-dollar industry of grift. That's why BLM was joked around and said that it really stands for buying large mansions, right? The idea was to take in lots and lots of money, and mostly for the people running the hustle on the country.
Well, what I find very interesting is that some of the black scholars that have pushed, these racial theories, they've been given MacArthur Genius Awards. And Genius Awards for what?
Next question. What can be done to reform our teachers' colleges? We'll start with James.
I have to refrain saying what I want to say. Our teaching colleges have been completely captured since 1992, so I didn't say burn them to the ground and start over, metaphorically, of course. But actually, they're going to have to more or less be dismantled root and branch in their current manifestation. The critical pedagogy, in particular, that's at the center of all of them and has been since 1992, has to be taken out. It has to be recognized that critical pedagogy is not a legitimate teaching methodology. It's not a legitimate teaching theory. And so that any college of education, in my opinion, that's operating on critical pedagogy or critical education theory is going to have all of its funding withheld more or less completely, and maybe be threatened to lose its accreditation until it starts teaching actual educational theory in place of this this scam that they've picked up, and like I said, have been running for over 30 years. Until we get that out of our teaching colleges and get our teaching colleges back down to basics, how to teach the actual subjects, not how to intervene in the psychology of the various people in your classroom, not how to do, mind-opening exercises or democratic classroom experiments or any of this kind of stuff, till we get down to the very bottom. How do you actually teach reading? Well, we know you teach reading through phonics. That actually works.
Right.
That doesn't work with a small population of children with special needs. So what do you do with that population and how do you serve them is a separate specialist course later on in your teaching. But at the beginning, if you're going to teach children to read, you teach them phonics. How do you teach them mathematics? Well, as a mathematician, you teach them the basic algorithms like long division that we all learned, and then later you can fill in the mathematical theory that led to the stuff that confused everybody in Common Core. As a mathematician, I was a little confused when it first came out because it all made sense to me, but it's not appropriate for a 9-year-old. He's not ready to understand complicated mathematical theory. So we've got to get rid of this kind of weird experimental thing. We've got to get rid of this critical pedagogy approach, and the only way I can understand that this is going to happen is if they lose their abilities. The three things that the colleges of education have that they need to have stripped from them is large amounts of their funding to the degree that that can be controlled, their ability to stay accredited as an institution of higher learning, and third, their capacity to hold a monopoly on licensure. States can very quickly act in that regard by taking away their monopoly on licensure without even revoking anything, just by opening alternative pathways to teacher licensure and giving them competition in the market. I think it's going to be absolutely necessary for us to look at those main dimensions if we're going to try to reform our teachers' colleges. And the target, of course, like I said, has to be getting critical pedagogy out and getting actual education theory in.
And I've been told by some of the headmasters at classical Christian schools that there are some teacher training programs that they use for their schools that are feeders for schools that are not into critical theory. I don't know, which schools or how many there are, but there are some places where teachers get trained the old-fashioned way, and they get snapped up very quickly by private schools that don't want to teach critical theory.
Kevin, anything to add?
Nothing to add.
All right. M. McDonough asks, how do you recommend influencing and educating parents, and especially non-parents, to understand how important this is to be aware of what's being taught in our schools? Start with Kevin.
I think the most important thing is for everyone to understand the level and degrees, the mechanisms, the schemes, the cultural influence of Karl Marx and Marxism. That is fundamentally what we're fighting. All of these things that we talked about boils down to Marxism in one form or another as the primary underpinning of what we're having to fight against right now. We need to understand that it's pervasive, that it's everywhere, and that means that we must think critically. We must, again, learn to think critically, and process through so we can help our children, grandchildren, community children understand from a critical thinking perspective where this stuff is flawed, where it's a false narrative, where it just doesn't apply, where it's hypocritical, those things. So we, you know, the most important thing that we have to do as parents and as parishioners, practitioners, is to make sure that we educate ourselves so we could, you know, so we can correct the false narratives as they are constantly, regurgitated and pervaded throughout culture.
Let me just appeal to some very basic rational self-interest, if I might. I know that you parents out there, and especially like the question asked non-parents out there, you know, you're in your 30s, maybe some of you are in your 20s, some of you are in your 40s, some of you are getting to be a little older parents, 50s, or grandparents, or your 50s or 60s. Let me just appeal to your rational self-interest. I know you're living high on the hog of the prime of your adulthood right now. Who do you think is going to run society when you're old? What world do you think you are going to age into? So the great dictators, evil dictators of history, in the sense of their power, like Adolf Hitler, were very clear. He had people who were resisting him during his National Socialism, and he said to them, "What are you? We have your children."
Right.
What are you? We have your children. Why? Because the children are going to grow up to be Nazis, and it doesn't matter whether you like Nazism or not. The society is going to become Nazi. Or the children are going to be communists. As Lenin said, you give me the child for 4 years, and I will plant a seed so deep you'll never uproot what grows. You are going to live in that world. Do you want to live in a world as you age, as you retire, as you go into the sunset years that you are hoping to enjoy the fruits of your life in a society that's run by Marxists and fascists and idiots and morons and racists? I don't think you do. This issue matters. This issue matters a lot. Your children, the children, all the children, whether they're your personal children or not, in our society, who are going to run this world as you age, who you will have to go deal with at the DMV or at the store or anywhere else, are not being educated. They're learning on TikTok. They're learning nothing at school, and what they do pick up at school is worse than if they didn't go. And then they're learning on social media apps, and look at the things that they're learning there. The earth is flat, everything's the fault of Jewish power. These things are actually what the kids are imbibing on their social media apps. They believe very wild and dangerous things. You don't want to live in that world. So if you don't have the rational self-interest to say, this matters because I live in this society today, you should have the rational self-interest to say, I'm going to live in this society later.
I have something more encouraging to say. And it has to do with the fact that Gen Alpha, that's the young group now, I think under 18, and Gen Z, there's a lot of conservatism among those children, and even some of the ones that have progressive parents. And as a person of faith, I believe what America needs is a spiritual revival. And our children and we need critical thinking, because we can learn all about CRT and Marxism and all these theories, but progressives would just change the language, they keep disguising it, it will keep morphing. And so it's difficult to keep, to keep up with them because they're constantly changing things. But if we have critical thinking skills, if we have wisdom, if we have discernment, we're not going to be deceived. And so I think that there are young people. I have met so many young people that are just really on fire. They are sharp, like that young man right there. And they're not going to be easily deceived. And I used to worry about what was going to happen until I go around speaking, and I feel very encouraged. I think there are people that they've already taken the baton. They're already running with it. And so I feel very encouraged about the future. And I think for us in America, we have a reprieve. I believe the election of Donald Trump that gave us a reprieve. Some of the things that are taking place, people have said, well, the next Democrat president will put it back in place. Can you imagine an America where they say, oh, we really missed affirmative action and DEI, we want to bring that back. Oh, we really believe there are 75 genders, we want to bring that back. I think that a lot of the common sense changes that were made will not be brought back that easily, but what will help America would be a spiritual revival and more critical thinkers.
Amen to that. So for our last question, I'm going to piggyback on what Carol just said, is that we're in a new post-Biden America. And the reprieve, I agree with you. There's a reprieve has been granted, but to each of you, and we'll start with James, is where do you see CRT going in the next few years? Is it going to go away, or is it going to come back in some other form? And talk to also about your optimism for the next 4 years, if you can.
I love when people ask me to talk optimistically. So I agree with what Carol just said. I don't think a lot of the very bad ideas that the left primarily has visited upon us are likely to be easily brought back. America, by and large, is sick of it. And as we start to move away from it, I don't think there's going to be a lot of the mainstream of America that wants to go back to it. And I think that way too many of us, it came in by stealth, by us not knowing what it was, by us not realizing that it was taking over our colleges and our schools. I don't think that they're going to be able to do it that way a second time. So I don't think that it's going to come back. CRT itself is largely going to be in its sunset. Now, I got to be a little grim here first. The grimness is that they don't let go of power that they've already taken. So they're going to latch on where they have power. So over the next 4 years, what we're going to see is a gulf between different areas in America. And primarily, I think most of the people, not all, but most of the people are going to move away from CRT. They're not going to be interested in seeing it anymore. But the institutions, like the schools in particular, the universities, some of the states like California, Kevin, I'm sorry, are going to, these deeply Democratic-controlled one-party states are going to hold on tighter, and they're going to dig in their claws and dig in their heels, and they're going to fight to keep it and push it as hard as they can to get those last drops of juice out of the lemon as they squeeze it. So I think that the fight is going to be particularly real, especially in those places. What I'm most afraid of, though, is that the monster that Korinitsatsia, as I called it earlier in Russian, the monster that CRT and DEI summon is ethnos. It's this idea of ethnic identity. And one possible answer to the black supremacy or POC or BIPOC or whatever supremacy of CRT is to say, well, the answer to that is white supremacy. And so that the CRT on the left can summon the reaction with white supremacy, real white supremacy on the right. And I'm very nervous that they will be able to do this with some degree of success. All the CRT has been so anti-white in its rhetoric and in its practice and in its policy that it will create a reaction. For a long time, I thought this might not arrive, but it seems that it is arriving, and it seems that it's being stoked. The fear for that is that it gives this left, again, in 2 years in the election for the midterms, or in 4 years for the election for the next president and Congress in 2028, it gives them the opportunity to say, see, we were right all along.
Right.
And maybe they can get their boomerang back. So it's going to be up to us to fight to make sure that what we are calling for is colorblind meritocracy. And like I said, here's your optimism for the next 4 years and the 40 years beyond that, is that America's tired of that. We tried their experiment of racial identity politics, and we hated it. It caused us problems. Everybody is moving on from it now. And so since we've moved on, since we've largely moved on from CRT, I think that if we can hold the course and we can guide our young people that the answer to racial identity politics is not more racial identity politics, then we defang the left. And we're actually able to move into a bright future where we put this chapter behind us. And I actually do think that we can do that. But we've got to be clear-eyed that the only way left for them to revive CRT is to revive it first by its reaction on the far right, and then to use that as their excuse to revive it on the far left.
Well, James, have you read my book, The New White Nationalism in America, Its Challenge to Integration, published in 2002?
I have not read that book, Carol.
But that book argued that multiculturalism and identity politics, that the arguments justifying that created the language, for white nationalism and white extremism. And I believe that there are about 5 chapters on affirmative action, but affirmative action, liberal immigration policies, black on white crime, the rise of the internet, those were some things I talked about that was creating an environment where we could have like racial conflicts, almost like a racial war. And the Eternal Diaries, have you read it?
No, ma'am.
You need to read the Eternal Diaries because it was written, it laid out, it's a novel about a race war, but it comes about because the left, all of this violence is happening, and in the end, the white people have gotten rid of all the Jews and the blacks, and they're living in this peaceful condition. But some of the things that I have seen done by progressives seems to have been designed to create conflict, and I believe that if we're not careful, we could end up, in a dangerous situation. And even though we have this reprieve and things are getting better, I think that there is no political solution to what ails, America or the world. And so we're just in this situation where there is a reprieve, but there are conditions out there. The left never gives up, and their intent is to burn down the whole thing. They want to destroy the institutions. They will not give up. And so my hope is that there will be some kind of spiritual revival that pushes back the darkness, but at the end of the day, we're just pushing back the darkness. So that's grim. I'm optimistic in the short term. I think we have an opportunity, to make America better, but at the end of the day, some very serious things could happen, and I'm very concerned about black crime and all these stories of mothers killing their children, and how the media has sort of just watered down black crime, or they haven't covered it, but it's very serious, and that has to be addressed. And I think that racial and ethnic minorities, when they commit crimes, we don't need to be characterizing in our data gathering system where they take some racial and ethnic minorities that commit crimes and they label them as white people. We need to address the problem that we have a black crime problem. I think that is part of us improving our society and actually just addressing what's wrong. So there's an educational problem, but there's also a crime and violence problem.
There's a couple things. I think that as a distinction, CRT and DEI are on the wane. I think that they're, with President Trump, with his executive orders and all of that, I think that they're on the wane. I don't think that they're coming back, especially not reconstituted in the way that they had been. They will be, they have morphed, however, and I see a lot of it in faith institutions. And the way that the faith leaders are saying it is out of reparations. Now, again, if we were critical thinkers, we'd all understand that reparations is a ridiculous notion, all right? Because, reparations basically says, look, give me restitution because you did something to me, right? So here's the short answer. We had the North and the South. And the Northerners were 99% or so white, fighting against the Southerners that were white. So, and it was the Northerners who set the blacks free. So whites actually set them free. So reparations, now, if you want to say reparations, there was a particular faction of people in the South, an actual group, an actual political group that is still in existence today. So if you want reparations, now, and I'm not an advocate for reparations, but I tell my Democrat brothers all the time, I say, look, bro, if you want to get reparations, man, look, let's go ahead and file a multi-billion lawsuit against those who actually did the enslavement in the South. That particular political party is here today, and I'll go down with you. I'll sign on there with you. So and you guys know who that political party is. But reparations is never supposed to be generally, globally, everybody got to pay me something. No, it's for the people who actually did the harms. Now, granted, the people who actually did the harms are gone, long gone, but the institution is still there. And if you want to carry that forward, if you just insist on that, great, let's do that. Every time I say that to a religious leader or whatever, they look at me like, oh, man, no, we can't do that. I said, well, why not? This is what you want, reparations. These are the people who did it, so let's go on and do it. Anyway, it shows you how if we were critical thinking and standing on our own 2 feet, we'd be able to have that argument and shut people up all the time. But a lot of us cower and, oh, well, reparations, I know, we feel bad. Stop it. We need to stop apologizing. Those days are over. We need to stand on our 2 feet. We got a strong, powerful president right now, stand on our 2 feet and do that. Now, the thing that I feel most optimistic about is that fathers are becoming more active in their households. And so I see a time where, Malachi 4 talks about the great and terrible day where the hearts of the children will be turned to the father and the hearts of the fathers will be turned back to their children. I believe we're in that season right now. I believe fathers are becoming more sensitized to what's happened to their children. They see that they're confused in a lot of ways. They got this dysphoria happening and all of this, and they understand that because they were not connected, that their child now is kind of, they need help. Their gender, all kinds of other issues, sex, gender, and all kinds of things that they're confused with. So fathers are becoming more active, and I believe this is going to give us a longer standing way that we can actually solidify communities, solidify households, and stave off the crazy leftist Marxist stuff. So I think fathers are really, really critically the key for helping as we progress in the future. They need to be connected to their children.
Well, Kevin, when you talk about religious leaders talking about reparations, to me, it's sort of ludicrous because the Bible talks about forgiveness. Yeah. And the Southern Baptists, I count at least 5 times they've apologized for slavery. I don't know why they keep apologizing, but people who are descendants of the, quote, victim groups, somewhere there has to be forgiveness. From one man, God created all nations of men. There's no place at all in the church for keeping grievances that are centuries long open.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, the audience, and thank you to our panel of speakers for your time tonight and for sharing your knowledge and insight. We hope that you will continue learning about this important and evolving topic in the month of February. We have an incredible lineup of events to approach CRT from multiple angles to help you, the parents, become the experts. Next week, join us online for DEI 102 with Chris Rufo and Robbie Starbuck for a focused discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion and how it is now unraveling. On February 19th, don't miss our virtual online screening of Uncle Tom 2, An American Odyssey, and ask your questions directly of the filmmaker Justin Malone and also cast member Chad Jackson. Lastly, on February 24th, we'll be connecting with Dr. Lindsay again, featuring his book, Race Marxism, for our February book club. And as it was said by the panel, if you want to really understand the issue, if you want to know the issue and speak authoritatively on it, especially to your school board or administrators, then you really have to read a book. Read the book. Read as many books as possible on the topic so that your foundation of knowledge is strong. And why read it alone when you can read it with friends? So please join us. That does it for CRT 101. This event has been recorded and will be posted to the online CRT toolkit at m4lu.org. That toolkit will be coming online within the week. And some of the questions were about where do I go to for information on this topic? That is going to be a great place to start. And if you want to go even deeper down the rabbit hole, it'll point you to a lot of places to go find that information. Please continue to follow M4LU as we have quite the lineup for the 2025 spring and fall semesters. And if you would like to support M4LU, first and foremost, please share our resources with friends and family because knowledge is power. And if you feel so inclined, please donate to our future efforts. Thank you again for joining us. As was famously said by James Madison, the advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only true guardian of liberty. And that is the mission of M4LU. Have a great night.